At 2:14 in the morning, a nurse stood alone at the center of Mercy Ridge Medical Center's emergency room, with blood soaking through her scrubs and a scalpel gripped in her left hand. Not because she was afraid, but because 3 armed men had just cornered her against the supply cabinet and made the catastrophic mistake of thinking she would beg. She didn't beg. She didn't scream. She looked at the largest one, the one holding the gun, and her voice came out so flat and controlled that every person in that ER who heard it felt something shift in the room, something primal, something that made the hair on the back of their neck stand straight up. And then 5 soldiers in full tactical gear burst through the ambulance bay doors, took one look at the woman these men were threatening, and snapped to attention. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the story you're about to watch is exactly the kind that will keep you awake until it's over. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's go. The overnight shift at Mercy Ridge Medical Center started the way it always did, with someone bleeding on a gurney and doctor. Ethan Caldwell making it everyone else's fault. Claire Donovan heard him before she saw him. His voice carried down the corridor, the way voices do, when the person attached to them has never once in their adult life considered the volume they were using. Because why would they? When you're the senior attending in a level 2 trauma center and you've spent 11 years being told you're exceptional, you stop noticing that you're loud. You stop us noticing a lot of things. Where's the 19 gauge? I asked for a 19 gauge 10 minutes ago. He was already moving through the doors when he said it. White coat open, stethoscope swinging, eye scanning the room with the particular kind of focus that lands on problems and assigns blame in the same motion. Someone talked to me. Coming, Dr. Caldwell. That was Priya at the medication station. Already pivoting, already reaching. Claire was at Bay 3, reapplying an occlusive dressing on a 40-year-old man named Dennis who had taken a kitchen knife to the forearm during an argument with a cutting board, meaned. His words, not hers. She pressed the dressing flat with 2 fingers, watched the seal, checked the color of the skin distal to the wound. Good perfusion. No arterial involvement. She had already run the assessment, already documented it, already flagged it for suture. Caldwell stopped at the foot of her bay. She felt him before she looked up. Donovan. He said her name the way you'd say a word you'd mispronounced and were mildly irritated about. What's the status on the arm? Superficial laceration, 4 centimeter length, no arterial involvement. Pressure's controlled. He's ready for suture. You sure? He wasn't asking because he doubted the wound assessment. She understood that now, after 6 weeks on this unit. He asked because he liked the pause that came after, the one where nurses second-guessed themselves and said things like, I think so, or you should probably check. That pause was worth something to him. It reminded everyone where the authority lived. Yes, Claire said. Caldwell leaned over and looked at the dressing anyway. He straightened up. Next time, lead with blood pressure. That's what I need to know first. His pressure was 118/74. I documented it when he arrived. Tell me when I walk in, not when I ask. He moved on. Dennis, the patient, looked at Claire with an expression that said, "What the hell was that?" And Claire peeled off her left glove, checked the documentation timestamp on the wall monitor, and said nothing. She had learned, in her first week at Mercy Ridge, that responding to Caldwell in front of patients only made the patients anxious and the situation longer. She had learned other things in other places, in other circumstances, that she kept entirely to herself. It was 11:47 p.m. The shift had 4 hours left. Mercy Ridge sat in the northeast quadrant of Denver, not the glamorous part, not the part that ended up in city tourism photography. It was a working hospital in a working neighborhood, a 6-floor brick building with a parking structure that was always at 80% capacity, a cafeteria that served food that was edible in the way that cardboard could theoretically contain food, and an emergency department that saw between 180 and 240 patients on a typical weeknight. It was not Caldwell's first choice posting. He'd made that clear in enough cow comments that it had become hospital mythology, that he'd wanted Johns Hopkins, had been in talks for a position at Mass General, and had ended up here due to some combination of circumstance and a contract dispute that no one fully understood. Whether or not any of that was true, it had produced in him a specific kind of resentment that he wore like a second white coat. He was good at his job. That was the maddening part. He caught things. He moved fast. He made decisions under pressure that were usually right. But good medicine and good behavior toward the people delivering it alongside him were, for Ethan Caldwell, entirely separate categories, and he saw no reason to connect them. Claire had known men like him before, not in hospitals. She hadn't applied for a position at Mercy Ridge because it was prestigious. She'd applied because it was the kind of place where a nurse with a non-traditional background, a 6-year gap in her civilian employment record, and an application that had been reviewed and partially redacted by a government agency before it ever reached HR would attract the least scrutiny. The ER was loud. The ER was busy. The ER did not have time to wonder about you. She'd been right about that. What she hadn't anticipated was Caldwell. Not his cruelty, specifically. She'd prepared for the possibility of a difficult supervisor. What she hadn't anticipated was how precisely his particular flavor of dismissal would mirror something she'd already spent years deprogramming herself from. The assumption that quiet meant weak, that deference meant incompetent, that a person who didn't shout back had nothing worth saying. She finished documenting Dennis's case, handed off to the suture tech and moved to the supply room to restock her kit. The supply room at Mercy Ridge was a narrow closet at the back of the ER, with a lock that stuck unless you knew to press down on the handle while you turned the key. She knew. She pressed. She went in. It was the only place in the department she could stand, in relative quiet, for 90 seconds at a time, and she had started using those 90 seconds the way she'd once used the 60 seconds between between checks on a forward operating base to recalibrate, to run through what she knew, what she needed, what came next. She pulled down saline, gauze, an extra pair of trauma shears. She was reaching for the tegaderm when she heard Caldwell's voice again, closer this time, in the hallway just outside. "She's not cutting it, Marcus. I've told Hendricks twice." A lower-voiced Dr. Marcus Webb, the overnight hospitalist, a man who had the interpersonal energy of a speed bump. "She seems fine to me. She's slow. She second-guesses. I had to redirect her on a dressing assessment tonight that any second-semester nursing student gets right. She's not trauma ER material. She's going to miss something one day, and it's going to land on this department." A pause. "Then Webb, you want to push for a transfer?" "I want Hendricks to handle it before I have to." Hendricks was nurse manager Sandra Hendricks, a woman in her mid-50s who ran the ER the way a person runs an organization when they are perpetually understaffed and underfunded, by maintaining a careful détente with the physicians who kept the department's metrics looking acceptable. Claire had spoken to her 4 times since orientation. All 4 conversations had been brief and professional, and entirely on Hendricks's terms. Claire stood in the supply closet and listened to Ethan Caldwell lay out the case for her removal from the department in a hallway where he believed he was unheard. She noted the clinical accuracy of some of his specific complaints. He was occasionally slower on documentation than optimal, and she had asked a clarifying question about medication, dosing, once that he'd interpreted as uncertainty rather than habit, and she noted the inaccuracy of most of the rest of it. She noted all of this with a flatness that she recognized as something she'd trained herself into years ago by necessity. She tucked the tegaderm under her arm and walked back out. Caldwell was still in the hallway. He saw her come out of the supply room. There was a fraction of a second barely visible, where he recalibrated. Then Donovan. Bay 7 just came in. GSW to the right shoulder. "Go. On it," she said, and moved. The man in Bay 7 was named Terrence. He was 26, heavyset, wearing a gray hoodie with a spreading red stain that had already gone dark at the edges. He was conscious, which was good. He was trying to sit up, which was not. His companion, a woman who'd driven him in and was currently pacing a 2-foot track beside the bed, was not helping with the sitting up. "You need to stay still," Claire said. She was already gloved, already at his side, already pulling back the hoodie fabric to assess the entry point. "I know it hurts. I need you to breathe and not move your right arm. Can you do that for me? Who's the doctor? I'm your nurse. The doctor is right behind me. Right now, I need to assess your wound. Does anywhere else hurt besides your shoulder?" He was scanning the room, agitated, breathing in the short way people breathe when adrenaline is still louder than pain. "Nah, just the shoulder. It went through, right? I don't feel it in there. I'm going to check." She palpated carefully around the entry site. Exit wounds present, posterior, through and through, and from the trajectory, it had missed the subclavian. She checked distal pulses in the right arm radial, present, slightly diminished. She elevated slightly, applied pressure. "You're right, it went through. That's actually better. I need your arm still. Can you make a fist for me with your right hand?" He made a partial fist, grip present. She exhaled through her nose. Caldwell appeared at the bay entrance. He looked at the wound, looked at Claire's positioning, looked at the monitor she'd already pulled over and clipped. "Where are we?" he said. "Through and through, right shoulder, posterior exit site. I'm ruling out subclavian involvement distal, radial pulse is present, reduced but present. BP is 104/68. Oxygen sat 96. He was ambulatory at arrival. Pain is localized, he's not reporting. Give me a chest x-ray and a CBC. And push 4 milligrams of morphine. He was already moving closer, already pulling on gloves. I'll take it from here." She stepped back to the position she was supposed to occupy, the one that Caldwell's body language assigned her every time he entered a bay, slightly back, slightly to the left, available for tasks, not for decisions. She prepared the morphine. She pushed it on schedule. She pulled the portable X-ray requisition and called it in. She did every part of her job correctly and invisibly, and Caldwell spoke over her to the patient, as though she were a piece of equipment that had been satisfactorily verified. After the X-ray came back clear no pneumothorax, bullet had tracked clean through muscle salt, and Terrence was stabilized and waiting for surgical consult. Caldwell peeled off his gloves at the sink and said to no one in particular, "She finally does something right." He said it quietly. He might have thought she was out of earshot. She wasn't. The woman pacing near Terrence's bed heard it. She looked at Claire. Claire finished her documentation entry, checked the time 2A, and moved to the next patient. What came through the ambulance bay at 9 a.m. was not a patient. It was 3 men who walked in the way people walk when they have already decided that the normal rules of a space don't apply to them. The first one through was tall, broad, wearing a canvas jacket over a dark shirt. The second was shorter, faster moving, eyes tracking the room in a way that was not the way civilians track rooms. It was systematic. It was practiced. It was the kind of visual sweep that people learn in environments where missing something has consequences. The third hung back near the door. The tall one went straight to the triage desk, where a unit clerk named Sonia was handling intake. "We're looking for someone," he said. Sonia, who had worked triage for 9 years and had seen most things, kept her expression neutral. "This is a medical facility. If you have a medical emergencies..." "We don't have a medical emergency. We're looking for someone who came in. Gunshot wound, right shoulder. Where is he? I can't give out patient information. If you want to speak to someone, I can get a..." "I'm not asking for a form." The tall one leaned forward. Not aggressively, not yet, but in the way that communicates very clearly that aggression is the next available option. "I'm asking you where he is." Claire was at the medication station, 12 feet away. She'd been pulling a chart. She looked up. She recognized the dynamic in approximately 1.5 seconds. She'd seen it in 3 countries, in 2 conflict zones, in situations, seconds, determined whether everyone in the room went home. The men at the desk were not hospital security problems. They were a specific kind of problem that hospitals were not built to manage. She also saw that Bay 7's curtain was open, and that Terence and his companion were visible from the entrance. She moved, not fast, not in a way that drew attention. She walked to Bay 7 with the measured pace of someone doing a routine nursing check, pulled the curtain 3/4 closed, and bent down to Terence's level. There are men at the front desk. Don't make any noise. Don't look out. Nod if you understand me. He nodded. His companion made a sound. Claire put one finger to her lips, not harshly, just clearly, and the woman went still. Claire straightened, turned, and walked back into the main ER. The tall one had moved away from Sonia. He was now in the main corridor, scanning. He looked at Claire. She looked back at him. "Can I help you?" she said. "You the nurse?" "I'm one of the nurses, yes." Gunshot wound came in. 20 minutes ago. Where is he? Patient information is confidential. I'm going to have to ask you to return to the waiting area, or I'll need to contact security. Security. He said it the way you'd say something you found mildly amusing. He looked at the second man, then back at Claire. "Lady, you really want to do this right now?" What happened in the next 4 seconds had a quality to it that Claire had only ever been able to describe in her own internal language, the one she used for these moments as the lifting of a layer. Like a lens filter removed, the soft focus of ordinary life pulling back to reveal the texture underneath. She was aware of the following: the positions of all 3 men, the distance between in herself and the nearest hard barrier, the location of the trauma bay crash cart, the fact that Sonia had already pressed the concealed security call button because Claire had seen her left hand drop below the desk, the fact that the security response time at Mercy Ridge was between 4 and 7 minutes depending on shift, and the fact that 4 to 7 minutes was a very long time. She was also aware that the second man, the one with the systematic eyes had, moved 2 steps to the left and was now between her and the Bay 7 curtain. She kept her voice exactly level. "You need to step back from that curtain." Or what? Or this situation gets significantly more complicated for everyone involved, including you. She paused. "Step back from the curtain." Something crossed his face. Not fear, not exactly. More like recalibration. She'd seen that too. People who were used to intimidation encountered something that didn't respond to it the way it was supposed to, and there was a fractional moment where the system updated. He didn't step back, but he didn't move forward. The tall one reached into his jacket. The crash cart was 6 feet to her right. The trauma shears were in her left hip pocket. The supply cabinet behind her had a lock that she could manipulate in under 2 seconds. She had already, without consciously deciding to, shifted her weight to the balls of her feet. And then the ambulance bay doors blew open. Not slowly. Not with the hydraulic patience of hospital automatic doors. They slammed back against their housings like something had hit them from outside, and through them came 5 people in tactical gear. Not Denver PD, not hospital security, not EMTs. Military, the real kind. Full kit, patches covered, moving in the specific tight formation that is not taught at the police academy. The lead figure was a woman, compact and fast, and she crossed the distance between the doors and Claire's position in approximately 4 strides. She stopped. She looked at Claire, and then she brought her right fist to her chest and snapped to attention. Behind her, the other 4 did exactly the same thing. The ER went completely silent. Caldwell had come out of a side room to see what the noise was. He was standing near the nursing station, white coat open, stethoscope around his neck, and his face held the expression of someone who has just watched a category of event that doesn't fit into any framework they currently own. Sonia had both hands visible on the desk. The 3 men in the canvas jackets had gone absolutely still. Because when 5 armed military personnel appear and immediately defer to a woman in blood-stained blue scrubs, the calculation changes. The calculation changes very fast. Claire looked at the lead soldier. "Sergeant Valles," she said. "Ma'am." The soldier's voice was precise, contained. "We picked up the tracking alert. We came as fast as we could. Apologies for the delay." Claire looked at the 3 men by the curtain. They were not moving. The tall one's hand had come out of his jacket empty. "These 3 are persons of interest in an active federal matter," Claire said. "They're to be detained for questioning. Do not let them leave this building." "Yes, ma'am." 2 of the soldiers moved toward the 3 men with a speed and coordination that made the whole thing look predetermined like choreography that everyone except the 3 men had rehearsed. The 3 men did not resist. They were the kind of people who understood. When they encountered something they hadn't prepared for, that resistance was a math problem, and the math had shifted. Caldwell took a step forward. "What the Samian needs to explain what's happening." "This is my ear, Dr. Caldwell." Claire's voice was quiet, not unkind, but it landed in the space between them with a weight that stopped him mid-step. "Please clear the floor." He stared at her. She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took for him to understand that she was not asking. He stepped back. The lead soldier, Valles, turned to Claire and said, at a volume low enough that it didn't carry to the nursing station, "The situation upstairs is secured. Transport is 12 minutes out. Do you need medical support? Check 7. The primary subject has a through and through to the right shoulder, stable, ready for surgical consult. Make sure he gets to the right hands." She paused. "The right hands. You know what I mean." "Understood, ma'am." Claire became aware then that she was still holding the chart she'd pulled from the medication station 9 minutes ago. Patient name at the top, Yolanda Marsh, 58F, right ankle sprain, triage priority 3. She set the chart on the counter. She pulled a fresh pair of gloves from the dispenser. She walked to Bay 2, where Yolanda Marsh had been waiting with her elevated ankle and her patients for 24 minutes. "I'm so sorry for the wait," Claire said. "Let's take a look at this ankle." Yolanda looked at her. Then she looked past her, toward the main corridor, where 5 soldiers were still managing 3 detained men, and the senior attending physician was standing against the wall with his arms crossed, and an expression that suggested his entire internal model of this ER had just been surgically revised without anesthesia. "Honey," Yolanda said slowly, "what in the world is going on out there?" "It's handled," Claire said. "Can you flex for me? I want to see your range of motion." Behind her, Ethan Caldwell hadn't moved. He was watching a woman he had called too slow, too hesitant, too soft for a real trauma center issue a detention order to federal military personnel in his emergency room, and the personnel had obeyed without question, without hesitation, without even a flicker of anything that looked like doubt. He was watching, and he was beginning to understand, with the particular nausea of realizing you have badly misread something, that he did not know the first true thing about the nurse he had been trying to remove from his department. Across the ER, in the corridor near the ambulance bay, Sergeant Valles stood with her hands clasped behind her back and her eyes on Claire's back, and her expression, if anyone had been paying close enough attention to see it, was not surprise. It was relief. The specific, layered relief of a person who has spent a long time looking for something they were afraid they might not find. The 3 men in canvas jackets were seated on the floor with their hands in zip ties by the time the Denver PD cruisers pulled up outside. Sonia at the desk was already on the phone with administration, her voice 2 octaves higher than usual. 2 of the soldiers had positioned themselves at the Bay 7 curtain, exactly as Claire had instructed. And Claire Donovan was leaning over Yolanda Marsh's ankle with a penlight, checking for swelling along the lateral malleolus, doing her job with the same careful attention she'd given every patient tonight, every patient for 6 weeks. Because the work was the work, and the ankle needed to be assessed whether the room had 5 soldiers in it or none. A little tender here, she said. Very, Yolanda confirmed. Okay, I think we're looking at a grade 2 sprain. I'm going to get you some ice, and we'll talk about imaging. She straightened. You're going to be fine. What she did not say, and what Yolanda could not have known, was that Claire's hands, steady as they looked, precise as they were, had been colder in the field. Much colder. She had assessed wounds in zero visibility, in hostile territory, with incoming fire 40 meters away, and her hands had been steadier then. She had learned to keep them steady the hard way, by doing it until steady was the only option left. The ER hummed around her. The monitors beeped. The fluorescent lights held their clinical indifference to everything that had just happened. Somewhere behind her, Caldwell was either filing a report or trying to process the structural collapse of his working assumption about her, and she found that she did not particularly care which one. Sergeant Valles appeared at the edge of Bay 2. Ma'am, transport is 9 minutes. There's a call waiting for you, secure channel. It's the colonel. Claire straightened from Yolanda's ankle. She looked at Valles. She looked at the chart in her hand. Tell the colonel I'll call back in 6 minutes, she said. Vales's expression didn't change. Yes, ma'am. And Valles. Claire glanced toward the door. Next time you pick up a tracking alert, come quiet. The ambulance bay doors are going to need maintenance now. The soldier's mouth moved in something that was almost barely a smile. Noted, ma'am. Apologies. Claire turned back to Yolanda. Okay, let's get you that ice. And in Bay 2 of Mercy Ridge Medical Center's emergency room, while federal soldiers managed a containment operation in the corridor outside, and a senior physician stood 15 feet away, with his entire professional confidence rearranging itself like furniture in an earthquake. Claire Donovan iced an ankle, charted a grade 2 sprain, and answered Yolanda's follow-up questions about compression, rapping with the calm and specificity of someone who had, a very long time ago, decided that the most dangerous thing she could show the world was exactly how much she already knew. The ice pack crinkled. The monitors beeped. Somewhere down the hall, one of the detained men said something loud and was told, very quietly, to stop talking. Caldwell, still against the wall, was looking at her. She did not look back. Not yet. Yolanda Marsh left Bay 2 at 2:51 M with a compression wrap, a discharge summary, and instructions to follow up with her primary care physician in 3 to 5 days if the swelling didn't reduce. She thanked Claire twice, and looked back over her shoulder once as she moved through the waiting room the way people do when they want to say something and can't quite find the sentence for it. Claire stripped off her gloves and dropped them in the biohazard bin. She pulled the curtain closed behind her and stood for a moment in the narrow space of the empty bay, running the numbers the way she always did after an incident. What had been controlled, what hadn't, what the gap between the two meant going forward. The 3 men were in custody. Terrence was in surgery prep. Valles had her 4 people positioned at every exit point that mattered. The tracking alert had been triggered by the GPS unit embedded in the operative briefing file that Terrence had been carrying, a file he shouldn't have had, transferred through a channel that had been flagged 6 weeks ago by an analyst whose name Claire wasn't authorized to know. She knew it anyway. She knew a lot of things she wasn't authorized to know, which was partly why she was here, in these scrubs, in this hospital, doing this job. Her phone vibrated against her thigh. The secondary phone, the one tucked inside the zippered pocket of her scrub pants beneath her badge holder. She pulled it out. The screen showed a single letter, K. She typed back a single number, 9, meaning situation contained, awaiting debrief window. The response came in 4 seconds. Window closes at 600. Call in. She put the phone away and walked back into the main ER. Caldwell was at the nursing station. He had a chart open in front of him, but he wasn't reading it. He was watching her cross the floor with the specific attention of someone who has recently discovered that they have been operating on false information and is now trying to figure out how much of their Recent behavior needs to be retroactively reconsidered. His face was doing something complicated. She recognized the shape of it. She'd seen it before, on people who'd made assumptions they'd have to live with. She sat down at the documentation terminal, 2 seats down from him, and opened her chart queue. He didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then, Donovan. She kept her eyes on the screen. Dr. Caldwell, you want to tell me what happened tonight? She typed a nursing note. Precise, clinical, correct. I handled a security situation. That's not what I'm asking. I know. She saved the note and opened the next chart. There's a lot I can't tell you. That's not a deflection. It's a factual constraint. I'm sorry I can't be more specific. He was quiet again. She could feel him working through it, sorting through the last 6 weeks against the 214A M version of her, trying to reconcile the two into something that made a coherent picture. She didn't particularly want to help him do that. Not because she was angry. She wasn't exactly, but because the reconciliation was his work to do, not hers. The soldiers, he said. They called you ma'am. Yes. Like you outranked them. I did outrank them. She paused, typing. I do. He sat with that. What rank? I'm not in active service. She looked at him then, directly, for the first time since the incident. And that's the last question I can answer tonight. We both have charts. It wasn't dismissive. She kept her tone level, matter of fact, the same tone she used when she told patients what she could and couldn't do for them. She turned back to the screen. Caldwell picked up his own chart. He didn't say anything else. At 3:20 a.m., Sandra Hendricks arrived. She came in through the administrative entrance in a navy blazer over a wrinkled shirt. She'd been called in, clearly, from somewhere she'd been sleeping or trying to, and her face held the expression of someone who had received a phone call that contained more information than she was equipped to process at 3A. She went directly to the nursing station, scanned the ER, and found Claire at Bay 4 wrapping the wrist of a teenager who had fallen off a skateboard at an hour he probably shouldn't have been on a skateboard. Hendricks waited. Claire finished the wrap, gave the kid his discharge instructions, watched him shuffle out with his helmet under his arm. Then she turned to her nurse manager. Miss Hendricks. My office, Hendricks said. Now, the nurse manager's office at Mercy Ridge was not really an office. It was a repurposed supply room with a desk, 2 chairs, and a whiteboard covered in shift rotation data that had been there so long it had developed a permanent shadow on the board behind it. Hendricks sat down. Claire remained standing, because there was only one chair that didn't have a stack of files on it, and Hendricks was in it. Federal agents called me at 2:45, Hendricks said. Not hospital security, not Denver PD. Federal. They told me that an active operation had intersected with our ER tonight, and that a member of my nursing staff was involved. She stopped. They told me to make sure she had whatever she needed, and to direct any administrative questions to a phone number I'm not going to repeat out loud. Okay, Claire said. Okay. Hendricks looked at her for a long moment. You've been on my floor for 6 weeks. You filed your paperwork, passed your orientation, got mediocre performance notes from Caldwell Mayans. I know about the performance notes. And tonight 5 soldiers walked into my ER and snapped to attention for you. Hendricks folded her hands on the desk. I'm not going to ask you to explain that. I'm told I shouldn't. But I am going to ask you one question, and I'd like you to answer it honestly. If I can, is my department safe? Are my people safe? Claire considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which meant taking 3 full seconds before answering. The situation tonight was contained. The people involved are in custody. The operation this connected to, the part I can speak to, is not based inside this hospital. She paused. Your department is safe. Your people are safe. That's true. Hendricks looked at her for another moment. Then she exhaled, a long, controlled breath that carried 6 weeks of questions she apparently hadn't known she should be asking. Caldwell put in a transfer request for you 2 weeks ago. I haven't processed it. I know that too. It'll stay unprocessed. Thank you. Don't thank me. Thank whoever's on the other end of that phone number. Hendricks stood. Get back on the floor. We're still down 2 nurses tonight. The thing about operating inside a cover was that it required a specific kind of ongoing performance. Not the dramatic kind, not the movie kind, where you sweated and looked over your shoulder and barely avoided discovery. The real kind was slower and more tedious. It was showing up on time, doing paperwork correctly, not being the person who stood out. It was absorbing Caldwell's commentary and not correcting it. It was filling in the gap between what you were and what you were presenting yourself as, over and over, in small moments that accumulated into something solid. Claire had been doing it for 6 weeks at Mercy Ridge, and for years before that, in contexts that would make 6 weeks at a Denver ER look like a meditation retreat. She walked back onto the floor at 3:34 a.m. and picked up where she'd left off. The ER had settled, not calm exactly, but the specific post-incident quiet that emergency departments fall into when something has happened and been resolved, and everyone is simultaneously processing it and pretending to be too professional to process it. So Sonia at the triage desk had clearly told the overnight security guard everything, because he kept glancing at Claire in the way people glance at someone they've just upgraded in their internal hierarchy. 2 of the other nurses, Priya and a man named Dale, who worked nights exclusively and spoke in full sentences only when absolutely required, had found reasons to be near the nursing station. When Claire returned, which was as close to a show of solidarity as Mercy Ridge's overnight shift apparently got, she didn't make a thing of it. She picked up a chart, checked the board, went to Bay 6. Bay 6 was a woman in her mid-60s named Rosaria who had come in with chest pain that had been triaged at Priority 2. Claire introduced herself, took a full history, ran the 12 lead. The tracing came back with changes she didn't like in leads 2 and 3 subtle, the kind that were easy to miss at 3:30 in the morning when you were tired and the patient looked stable and was telling you she was probably fine. She flagged it immediately, put in the cardiology consult, pushed aspirin, got a second IV access in case things moved fast. Caldwell came into the bay 17 minutes later for the cardiology handoff and looked at the set she'd arranged and the notes she'd already written and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Good catch on the EKG." It was not an apology. It wasn't meant to be. But from Ethan Caldwell at 3:47 in the morning, after what had happened an hour ago, it was the closest available equivalent, and Claire recognized it for what it was. "Thank you," she said. She left him with the cardiologist and moved on. The call to the colonel came at 4:15 from the single-stall bathroom near the ambulance bay that had a broken ventilation fan, which was loud enough to cover a conversation if you stood close enough to it. She ran the water too, the way she always did. Old habit. Donovan. The voice on the other end was not warm and was not cold. It was the voice of a person who had learned over 30 years to occupy the exact center between the two. Colonel Henry Marsh, Joint Special Operations, command liaison to the intelligence cell that Claire technically still reported to, even in her current civilian status. Colonel. Situation report. 3 persons of interest detained, transferred to federal custody at 03:15. Primary subject secured in surgical prep with verified federal medical oversight. Package was intact. Terrence was the courier, not the principal. He didn't know what he was carrying. She paused. The tracking in bed worked. It always works. A beat. Cover integrity? Compromised at the ER level. Nursing manager and attending physician both observed the military response. Both have been given the appropriate version by federal liaisons. The physician. Caldwell? She didn't ask how he knew the name. She never asked that. He saw what he saw. He doesn't have context. I don't think he'll pursue it. Will monitor. Another pause, longer. There's a development, Claire. She noticed he'd used her first name. He did that when the information was something he considered her specifically entitled to hear. As a as opposed to something he was transmitting operationally. Go ahead. The 3 men you detained tonight were not independent contractors. They're linked to a domestic network we've been tracking since April. The network has a contact inside Mercy Ridge. She went still. Inside the hospital. Medical staff. We don't have the identity yet. That's why you're staying. She'd assumed she was staying. She'd been operating under that assumption since week 2, when the pattern in the hospital's patient intake data specifically which patients were being referred upstream and to whom had started looking less like coincidence and more like a pipeline. But hearing it confirmed, stated plainly, at 4:15 in the morning, while the ventilation fan rattled above her, had a particular weight to it. How many people in the network? Locally, we think 4. 1 inside the hospital, 3 external. 2 of your 3 tonight are confirmed external nodes. The 3rd is new. We're running him now. The colonel's voice shifted register slightly, the way it did when he was about to say something he'd rather not say. The internal contact has access to patient records. Surgical schedules. They've been redirecting specific high-value patients people with federal protection statuses to independent facilities where oversight is reduced. Claire thought about Rosaria in Bay 6, with her subtle EKG changes. She thought about the cardiology consult she'd pushed through. She thought about how easy it would be, in a busy ER, to redirect a patient to a different specialist. A different facility, a quiet one, where the oversight was whatever the person doing the redirecting decided it was. I need the timeline on the internal contact, she said. Working on it. 48 hours. Maybe 72. Understood. She looked at the bathroom wall. Scuffed white paint, a crack near the soaps dispenser that someone had covered with a strip of medical tape that had yellowed and started to peel. Ordinary. Colonel, the operation tonight wasn't clean. I'm aware. The tracking alert was supposed to be passive. Silent. The field team coming in loud was a deviation from protocol. The field team came in loud because the situation read as a threat to life scenario. Valets made a judgment call. It was the right call, Claire said. I'm not questioning Valets. So I'm saying it's burned the location. Anyone in that network who has eyes on this hospital knows something happened here tonight. They'll either go quiet or accelerate. The colonel was quiet for a moment. Which do you think? Accelerate. If the internal contact knows their external nodes are burned, they'll move whatever they were planning to move before they lose the opportunity. She turned off the running water. I need to know who it is before they do. Then find them. No ceremony, no encouragement. Just the flat operational instruction of a man who had been giving operational instruction since before Claire was in training. Report at 0600 unless the situation changes before then. The line went dead. She stood in the bathroom for another 10 seconds, running the updated picture through the architecture of what she already knew. One person in this hospital, Sumsion, who had access to surgical schedules, patient records, referral pathways. Someone who had been here long enough to build the kind of access that didn't attract attention. Someone who had, for months, been quietly shunting vulnerable people into the dark. She had 48 hours, maybe fewer. She unlocked the bathroom door and walked back onto the floor. The last 90 minutes of the overnight shift had the quality that all very long nights eventually arrive at, a kind of stripped-down clarity, where the noise had burned off and what was left was just the work and the people doing it. Priya was on her 4th coffee. Dale had developed a 1,000-yard stare that meant he was running on muscle memory alone. Sonia at triage was processing a waiting room of 8 with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had stopped expecting the night to end and made peace with its continuation. Claire worked. She did it carefully and completely, the way she always did, not performing competence now that people were watching her differently, but because it was the standard she held herself to, regardless of who was in the room. She caught a medication dosing error on a pediatric patient that the night pharmacist had flagged but not escalated, and escalated it. She sat with an elderly man who had come in alone at 5 a.m. with abdominal pain and was quietly terrified, and she stayed with him longer than she technically had time for because he was alone and the terror was real. She argued, briefly and successfully, with a radiology tech who wanted to push back a chest CT on a patient whose respiratory status was declining faster than the Q position reflected. She was not thinking about Caldwell. She wasn't thinking about Valez, or the colonel, or the 3 men in federal custody. She was thinking about the patients in front of her, one at a time, in the order they appeared. This was the thing she couldn't explain to people who hadn't done what she'd done. The way the work, real work, was its own kind of discipline. Not a distraction from the bigger picture, but a component of it. You stayed sharp in the field by staying sharp everywhere. You kept your hands reliable by using them constantly. You maintained your cover by making the cover true. She actually was a nurse. That wasn't performance. She'd completed the program, passed the boards, logged the clinical hours. She'd done it in 14 months instead of the standard 24 because she had the kind of focus that comes from every skill set you own is a potential survival tool. And nursing was no different from any other system she'd learned. At 5:47 a.m., she was updating her final chart of the shift when Caldwell stopped beside her. He stood there for a moment. She could see him in her peripheral vision hands in his coat pockets. Weight shifted slightly to the left, the way he stood when he was thinking rather than moving. The EKG patient, he said. Rosaria Fuentes. Cardiology is saying, you caught a ENS STEMI that would have been missed on standard triage. She's in the cath lab now. Good. You caught it at 3:30 in the morning after a significant security incident. The timing doesn't change the clinical picture. He was quiet for a moment. I've submitted 17 negative performance notes on you in 6 weeks. I know. I'm going to submit a correction. She looked up from the screen. He was watching her with the expression of someone completing an unpleasant task they'd assigned themselves. Not comfortable, but committed. You don't have to do that. Yes, I do. His jaw moved slightly, the involuntary thing people do when they're forcing themselves to stay with something. I was wrong about you. I said things that were... He stopped. Started again. I was wrong. I wanted you to know. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't thorough. It covered maybe a fifth of what had been done. But she could see that it was real. That it cost him something to say it, and she weighed it against what she'd already absorbed and found that she could take it at face value without diminishing herself. Thank you, she said. That's enough. He nodded. Walked away. She saved the chart, logged out of the terminal, and began gathering her things for end of shift. The locker room, at the end of a night shift, had its own particular atmosphere, the antiseptic residue of overnight fluorescent light, the specific exhaustion of bodies that had been upright and functional for 8 to 12 hours, the slightly manic edge of people transitioning from high alert mode into something approximating ordinary life. Claire had been through this transition enough times that she'd built a ritual for it, 4 specific things in a specific order, designed to draw a clean line between what she'd been doing and what came next. First, change out of scrubs completely. The scrubs went into the sealed bag she kept in her locker, not the standard hospital laundry bin, because she'd learned early that the things sometimes embedded in fabric were better handled by herself. Second, wash her hands up to the elbow, systematically, the full clinical protocol. Third, check both phones. Personal phone, first one message from her sister, 2 days old, asking when she was coming to Portland. She would answer it today. She always meant to answer it today. The secondary phone, one new message from Valez. Package secured. External nodes processing. Internal timeline, 48 HRS. Confirmed. She deleted the message. Fourth, 3 minutes, sitting on the bench with her eyes closed, running through the shift what had happened, what it meant, what came next. What came next was the internal contact. 48 hours, maybe less. Someone on this floor, someone with access to the systems she now understood, were being used as a pipeline. She ran the variable list. The person would have been here long enough to build trust, to accumulate access that didn't require explanation. They would have the kind of role that touched patient, routing, scheduling, referrals, discharge planning, or clinical authority. They would be, and this was the part she kept coming back to, invisible. Not invisible because no one saw them. Invisible the same way she was invisible because they had cultivated the impression of ordinariness so thoroughly that scrutiny slid off them. She knew what that looked like from the inside. She opened her eyes. The locker room was empty now. The rest of the night shift had cycled out while she sat. She laced up her shoes, put on her jacket, closed her locker. In the hallways outside, the day shift was beginning its arrival, the particular influx of morning energy and coffee cups and handoff reports. She moved through it, anonymous again in civilian clothes, heading for the exit. She was passing the scheduling board near the main nursing station when something snagged her attention. Not a dramatic thing, just a number that didn't match. A patient transfer notation logged at 4:40 a.m. while she'd been on the floor during the window when the ER was at its quietest. A transfer she hadn't seen processed to a facility she didn't recognize the name of. She stopped, looked at it again. Patient, male, 58, federal employee designation visible in the file header. She had to look quickly. The standard view didn't show it prominently. Transferred to a place called Westlake Rehabilitation Associates at 4:40 a.m. She pulled out her personal phone and typed the facility name into a search. Standard results. Professional website. Physical therapy. Looked like exactly what it said it was. She looked at the transfer notation again. The authorization signature at the bottom was an attending physician's stamp. She photographed the screen. Fast, quiet, the phone already back in her pocket. Then she looked at the physician name on the stamp. It wasn't Caldwell. It was a name she'd seen on the shift board when she started at Mercy Ridge 6 weeks ago, had filed in the back of her working memory as unremarkable a hospitalist who worked overnight rotations, who moved through the department with the unhurried ease of someone who had been there for years, who was liked and trusted and unremarkable. Dr. Marcus Webb. She stood at the scheduling board for 2 seconds, 2 controlled, deliberately ordinary seconds, then turned and walked toward the exit at the same pace she'd been walking before. Behind her, without looking back, she could feel the board and its logged notation and its authorization stamp sitting there in the morning light, perfectly ordinary, perfectly documented, perfectly designed to look like exactly what it wasn't. She pushed through the exit door into the cold Denver morning and pulled out the secondary phone. She typed 4 characters to Valez, MW, confirm. The response came before she reached her car. Already flagged. Surveillance active. Do not move on him yet. She stopped walking. Read it again. Do not move on him yet. Meaning they already knew, or thought they knew. Meaning this was further along than the colonel had indicated at 4:15, and the 48-hour timeline had already been revised, and someone had made a decision about Marcus Webb that Claire had not been informed of. She stood in the parking structure with the morning cold coming through the concrete and thought about Rosaria Fuentes in the cath lab. She thought about the 58-year-old federal employee now, somewhere in a rehabilitation facility that looked real but might not be. She thought about a man who had walked through this ER for years, slow-moving and forgettable, and trusted, while every system he had access to quietly funneled the wrong people toward the wrong destinations. She thought about how long it took to build a thing like that, how many people it required, how far the architecture extended beyond one hospitalist in one Denver ER. She got in her car. She did not start the engine. She sat in the parking structure and worked through the new shape of it because something in the 4-word instruction to not move on him had a quality to it that she recognized from other operations. Other moments when she'd been told to hold position. That instruction didn't mean we've got it handled. It meant something more specific. It meant we need him to keep operating so we can see where the network runs. They were going to let Mark's web keep working. They were going to watch him. They were going to let him transfer patients, log authorizations, build his false record so that they could trace the full network before they closed it. And Claire was the only person in that hospital who knew what he was, and she was being told to say nothing, to watch, to let it continue. She started the engine. She'd been in this position before, where the operational logic was sound, and the human cost of it sat in your chest like something that wouldn't dissolve. She'd made the calculation before. She knew how to carry it. What she hadn't carried before was the specific knowledge that somewhere in Westlake Rehabilitation Associates, wherever that actually was, there was a man with a federal designation who had been transferred out of Mercy Ridge at 4:40 this morning by a doctor who had just finished watching 5 military soldiers defer to a nurse he'd assumed was the least consequential person on the floor. Her phone buzzed. Secondary line, Valles again. Asset at Westlake is confirmed secure. Federal oversight in place. Do not act. She exhaled. The asset was secure. Webb hadn't burned the patient. He'd been followed. Or the facility was already monitored. Or something else was operating that she wasn't fully read into. She typed back. Confirmed. Holding. She put the car in reverse. The morning was gray and thin over the Denver skyline. The kind of early light that didn't commit, that kept everything provisional. She drove out of the parking structure and turned north, toward the apartment she'd rented, under a name that was hers legally, but didn't appear in any searchable database connected to her actual history. She was halfway down the block when her personal phone rang. Not the secondary line. Her personal phone, which had a different number, a different case, and a contact list that contained her sister, her former nursing school advisor, and a dentist she'd seen once in February. The screen showed a number she didn't recognize. She let it ring. It rang 4 times. Then it went to voicemail. 30 seconds later, the secondary phone buzzed. Valles, did you just receive a call on your personal line? She felt the temperature of the situation change. She typed back, yes. Unknown number. Did not answer. 3 seconds. 5. 8. Get somewhere secure now. Personal line is burned. She drove. She drove 3 blocks, turned right again, doubled back through an alley behind a Vietnamese restaurant whose exhaust fan was pushing warm air into the cold morning, and pulled into the back lot of a dry cleaner that didn't open until 9. Old habit. Put distance between yourself and your last known position. Vary your route. Don't stop somewhere with cameras at eye level. She killed the engine and sat. The personal phone was in her left hand. She looked at the unknown number on the missed call screen, a 720 area code, which meant Denver, which meant nothing, because area codes were the least meaningful piece of information on a modern phone. She pulled the secondary phone with her right hand and typed the number to Valles, character by character. The response came in 40 seconds. Burner. Registered to a convenience store on Federal Boulevard. Purchased 6 days ago. We're pulling purchase footage now. 6 days ago. Before last night's incident. Before the tracking alert. Before any of it had broken open. Someone had been watching her for at least 6 days, and they'd waited until this morning to call. The timing wasn't random. It was a message. We know what you are, and we know what happened last night, and we're still here. The call itself was the content. They hadn't needed her to pick up. She typed to Valles, personal line burned. Switching to protocol 2. Then she powered off the personal phone, removed the SIM, and put both pieces in the glove compartment. Her sister's unanswered message went with it. She'd deal with that later. She'd been dealing with later for 6 years. The dry cleaner's lot was quiet. A pigeon was working on something near the dumpster. The morning light had committed slightly more than it had 10 minutes ago. The sky had moved from gray to the pale, washed-out blue of a Denver morning that wasn't going to warm up for hours. She had to think through this cleanly. The network knew her cover was compromised, or suspected it. The personal line being burned meant they'd gotten close enough to her secondary identity infrastructure to find a number that wasn't supposed to be findable. That required either significant technical resources or someone inside the federal apparatus who had access to the kind of background documentation that supported her cover. Both possibilities were serious. The second one was worse. She called the colonel on the secondary phone. He picked up in 2 rings, which meant he was already awake and already working, which meant valets had looped him in the last 3 minutes. "Tell me you're somewhere clean," he said. "Back lot on Colfax. No cameras. My personal line is burned. I'm on protocol 2. We know. We're running the purchase footage now." A brief pause. "Claire, there's been a development in the last 40 minutes. The call wasn't the development. The call was the signal. The development is what it was signaling." She heard papers moving on his end, the specific shuffle of someone working from a physical file. Webb logged a second transfer at 0540. After your shift ended. A patient who came in through standard triage at 0400 upper GI bleed, admitted to internal medicine, stable. No federal designation, no flagged status. Webb transferred him to Westlake at 0540 with a discharge authorization that cited bed availability. She worked through it. Webb transferred a stable, non-flagged patient to Westlake 30 minutes after my shift ended. Yes, which means either Webb transferred a patient he believed was relevant to the network meaning. The patient has a status Webb knows about that isn't in the standard file, or Webb is accelerating, moving faster because of last night, or both. She leaned back against the headrest. "You said the first Westlake asset was secured. Federal oversight in place." He is. Another pause. "The second patient's status at Westlake is currently unconfirmed." She sat up straight. Unconfirmed, meaning you've lost contact with the oversight team there. Unconfirmed, meaning the oversight team's last check-in was 0515 and they missed the 0540 window. It may be a communication issue. It may not be. The math was simple and ugly. If Webb had transferred a second patient to Westlake at 5:40 and the oversight team had gone dark at 5:15, one of 2 things had happened. Either the oversight team had a comms failure equipment, technical, something mundane, or someone had moved against them, which meant Westlake wasn't a safe house anymore, which meant the first patient might not be safe either, regardless of what Velez had told her 20 minutes ago. "I need a location on Westlake," she said. "Claire, I know what you're going to say. We have people? Your people's last contact was 25 minutes ago, and you have 2 civilians at an unsecured location. Where is Westlake?" The colonel was quiet for 4 seconds. This was not a long time by normal standards, but the colonel was not a person who took 4 seconds to decide small things. When he took 4 seconds, it meant he was making a calculation about risk versus asset preservation, and the asset in this case was her operational cover, her position inside Mercy Ridge. 6 weeks of work. He gave her the address. "You go in quiet," he said. "Assessment only. You do not engage unless there is an immediate threat to life." "Understood." "Claire." "Yes." "Velez is 12 minutes behind you. Wait for her if you can." She started the engine. "I'll see how it looks." She pulled out of the lot and drove south. Westlake Rehabilitation Associates occupied the ground floor of a beige commercial building on a street that had a tire shop, a payday loan office, and a children's dance studio with a hand-painted sign. The rehabilitation facility's front window had the logo in dark green lettering and Venetian blinds that were currently angled closed. A parking lot ran along the left side of the building. 2 cars in the lot at 6:10 a.m. a gray sedan, and a white panel van. Claire drove past without slowing, turned at the next corner, came around the back side of the block, and found an access alley that ran behind the row of commercial buildings. She parked and went the rest of the way on foot. The back of the Westlake building had a service entrance steel door, no window, a keypad entry system that was consumer grade and would take her approximately 45 seconds to bypass, which was 45 seconds she didn't want to spend standing in an alley if the building wasn't clear. She checked the door frame for contacts first. No alarm indicator. She checked the hinges. The door opened outward, which meant the hinges were accessible from outside, and she could pull the pins if the keypad was harder than it looked. It wasn't harder than it looked. She was inside in 50 seconds, which was 5 more than she'd estimated, and she filed that information away with the mild irritation of someone keeping an honest ledger. The service entrance opened into a narrow, hallway-bare concrete floor. Fluorescent strip lighting. The particular smell of a medical facility that was trying to smell like lavender, and mostly just smelled like industrial cleaner, trying to smell like lavender. Storage rooms on the left. A laundry alcove on the right. Ahead, the hallway branched, left toward what looked like a clinical area, right toward reception. She went left, slow, listening. The building was quiet, but not empty quiet. There was the hum of HVAC, a refrigeration unit, somewhere, the ambient electrical presence of a building that was running. And underneath that, at the edge of perception, voices. 2 of them, male, coming from the clinical area ahead. She moved to the wall and worked forward by inches, keeping her shoulder blades against the concrete, minimizing her profile. The voices got clearer. Already got the call. 20 minutes, maybe less. This voice was flat and professional, the cadence of someone giving status updates, not having a conversation. The second one's going to be a problem. He's more alert than the chart indicated. The second voice had an edge of something in it. Not panic, but the controlled friction of a person managing a complication they hadn't planned for. Give him another 2 milligrams. That'll cover the window. She stopped. Give him another 2 milligrams. The phrase landed in her clinical brain and the operational brain simultaneously, and both of us reached the same conclusion. In the same second, someone was being sedated without consents, without proper monitoring, by people who were not interested in his recovery. 2 milligrams of what depended on what he'd already been given. If he was on midazolam, another 2 milligrams was manageable in a monitored setting and dangerous in an unmonitored one. If it was something else, the calculation changed entirely. She needed to see the room. The hallway ended in a T-junction. The voices were coming from the right branch, behind a door that was 3/4 closed. She got low, not on the floor, but crouched, moving the sightline out of the standard visual zone where people look when they check a hallway, and angled her head to see through the gap at the door's hinge side. 2 men. One was standing near a window, phone in hand, the flat-voiced one. He was mid-30s, close-cropped hair, the physical economy of someone who maintained a fitness regimen for practical rather than aesthetic reasons. The second man was seated at a small monitoring station blood pressure cuff, pulse oximeter, attending to a patient in a reclining chair. The patient was male, late 50s, eyes half open in the soft, unfocused way of someone chemically subdued, but not fully under. His respiration was shallow but regular. A second recliner was occupied by another patient, also male, this one fully unconscious, an IV line running into his left arm. 2 patients, one IV running, one in the process of being redosed. She pulled back from the door and checked the time on the secondary phone. 6:14. Valleys was 12 minutes out from when she'd left the dry cleaner's lot, meaning she was roughly 4 minutes away now, possibly less if she was pushing. 4 minutes was a long time if the man in the chair was about to receive another 2 milligrams of a sedative that his body hadn't been pre-cleared for in a clinical context. She made the decision in the way she always made decisions under pressure, not by dwelling on them, but by running the variables once, fast, and committing. She straightened, stepped to the door, and pushed it open. Both men looked up. She was already across the threshold and had the wrist of the man at the monitoring station before either of them had completed a full second of processing. She didn't hit him. She redirected, using his own forward startle reflex to bring his right arm up and behind him in a control hold that took him out of the equation without taking him off his feet, because she needed him conscious and she needed information before valets arrived and the situation became official. The flat-voiced man by the window moved. She'd anticipated it. She released the first man's arm. He wasn't going anywhere, without choosing a significant amount of pain, and turned toward the window. "Don't," she said. He stopped. He was calculating. She could see it, the rapid assessment of whether she was law enforcement, whether backing down cost him more than it bought him, whether the third option was available. "Hands," she said. "In front of you now." He put his hands in front of him. He was not happy about it. He was also, she noted, the kind of person who got unhappy in a specific controlled way that meant he wasn't done. He was just repositioning. She didn't take her eyes off him. "What did you give them?" No answer. "The patients. What are they on and what dosage?" The man at the monitoring station, the one with his arm in a position he hadn't chosen, Tolson said a sound that was almost a laugh. "You think we're going to... I think in about 3 minutes, this building is going to have federal agents in it, and you're going to want a cooperation record that starts before they arrive rather than after." She kept her voice flat, not threatening, informational. "What did you give the patients?" A beat. 2. The flat-voiced man by the window made a small decision she could see in his jaw. Versed, 2 milligrams per patient, initial dose at 05:45. Midazolam, the first dose at 5:45, a second dose pending. She looked at the IV line on the fully unconscious patient. The bag was running, and if it was running midazolam at a continuous rate rather than bolus doses, the situation was different again. She crossed to him in 3 steps, checked the bag label. A saline flush with a small syringe of Versed clipped to the line, not a drip, staged for a push. The push hadn't happened yet. She uncoupled the syringe from the line, set it on the tray where it couldn't be reached easily without her noticing. The unconscious patient's pulse ox was reading 94%, low end of acceptable. His respiratory rate was 12, which was the floor of normal, anything lower, and she'd need to consider reversal. She watched his chest move for 15 seconds. 12 per minute, regular. She left the monitoring equipment where it was and looked at the man in the recliner. Partially sedated one. The one who'd been labeled as more alert than expected. His eyes tracked to her. The unfocused quality shifted. Not clarity, but something like recognition. An effort. "You're in a medical facility," she said quietly, close to him. "You're safe. I'm a nurse. Don't try to speak. Just stay still. You're going to be okay." His hand moved, a small, incomplete reach toward her arm. She let him touch her sleeve. He held it. Behind her, she heard movement. The flat man had shifted his weight. She turned, and in the half-second before she completed the turn, she understood 2 things at once: that he had moved to give himself a better angle on the door, not on her, and that he had made a phone call in the 30 seconds she'd been focused on the patients. The secondary phone buzzed against her leg. "Velez, 2 minutes out. Do you have the location secure?" She looked at the man by the window. He was looking back at her with the calm of someone who has just changed the shape of the situation and knows it. She typed back, negative. "Make it 1 minute." The man from the monitoring station, his name, turned out to be Rourke, which, she learned later, not then attempted to move while she was typing. She caught it without looking. The way you catch things when your peripheral awareness has been trained to respond faster than conscious thought. A shift in body weight. The particular sound of a shoe, sole on concrete, when a person is making a lateral move rather than a stationary adjustment. She put him back in the control hold, firmer this time, and said nothing. "You're making a mistake," the flat-voiced man said from the window. "You're stalling," she said. "Your backup is not closer than mine." He said nothing, which told her she was right. The unconscious patient's monitor alarmed a single tone, not a critical alarm, just a movement artifact from his arm shifting. She checked the reading. Still 94%, respiratory rate stable. She silenced the alarm and checked her watch. 1 minute and 20 seconds since she'd entered. The back door opened. Velez came through first, which was correct, and behind her were two of the soldiers from the night before, and a third person. Claire didn't recognize civilian clothes, federal badge clipped to his jacket, a face that was aggressively unremarkable in the way that some federal agency faces were specifically cultivated to be. He looked at the room, looked at the two patients, looked at Claire holding Roark's arm in a control hold, and his expression did something that passed through professional displeasure so fast it was almost imperceptible. Donovan, Valles said. The IV on the unconscious patient has a versed bolus, staged and uncoupled. 2 milligram midazolam initial dose to both patients at 05:45. Pulse ox on the unconscious patient is running low. He needs monitoring and possibly reversal if it drops below 90. The semi-conscious patient is stable and aware. She released Roark's arm. These two are yours. The unremarkable federal agent stepped forward. I'm Agent Decker. I was the oversight lead on. I know what you were, Claire said. Where did your team go dark? His unremarkable face produced a flicker of something. Comms failure. Technical issue. Not. It wasn't a technical issue. The flat-voiced man by the window said it without looking at Decker said it with the specific relish of someone who has been holding information and gets to deploy it at the moment it hurts the most. You have a leak, Agent Decker. Has been a leak for 4 months. You knew we had this location before you sent your team here. Decker's unremarkable face became very still. The soldiers had both men in custody now. Roark sitting against the wall, the flat with his hands behind him. Both calm in the way that people are calm when they've decided the next phase of the operation is someone else's problem. The flat-voiced man was calm in a specific way that she trusted least. He's not wrong, Claire said to Decker, because she needed it said out loud in front of witnesses, and she needed it said now before whatever Decker's training told him to say next. Your oversight team's location was burned before they arrived. That's why the comms window failed. They were moved, or their equipment was compromised, and you need to account for your team before anything else in this room. Decker looked at her. He did not like what he was hearing, and he did not like who was saying it. And both of those facts were visible on his carefully maintained, unremarkable face in a way that told her he was good at his job, but had a tell when his authority was being questioned by someone he hadn't cleared. We'll locate the team, he said. How many? 2 agents. And they missed their 05:40 check-in. That's 35 minutes. She kept her tone level. Clinical. They need to be found. We're working. I understand you're working on it. I'm telling you the timeline, in case it's not clear in the brief. She turned away from him, because she'd said what she needed to say, and continuing to say it was diminishing returns. She went back to the unconscious patient and checked his pulse ox again. 93% now. The number had dropped 1 point in 4 minutes. She looked at Valles. He needs flumazenil if this keeps dropping. Does your team have a field kit? Valles was already reaching for the pack on her back. Behind Claire, Decker was on his phone. She caught fragments. 2 agents. Last confirmed location? And yes, both sites. I want teams at... And then a longer silence that meant he was listening to something he hadn't expected to hear. She administered 0.2 milligrams of flumazenil, the reversal agent for midazolam slowly, watching the monitor. The pulse ox held at 93, then ticked to 94. The patient's respiratory rate increased marginally. Not dramatic, but the right direction. She watched for 2 full minutes before herself stepped back. The semi-conscious man in the recliner was more alert now, the versed wearing off without additional dosing. He was looking around the room with the slow, deliberate attention of a person reassembling their context. His eyes found Claire and stayed there. Hospital? He said. His voice was rough, slightly slurred. Not exactly. But you're safe. She checked his blood pressure on the cuff, a little low, 102/66, but not alarmingly. Do you remember being transferred this morning? He thought about it. Doctor signed something. Said I was being moved. Do you remember the doctor's name? He thought again. Longer this time. Webb. Dr. Webb. She wrote nothing down. She didn't need to. Decker appeared at her elbow. His voice had changed register. It was quieter now, and the quality of a man managing a revelation had replaced the quality of a man managing his authority. We located one of the agents. She's at a motel 6 blocks from here. She's physically okay. She was told by a supervisor to stand down from the location. A supervisor told her to stand down. By phone. We're verifying the call origin now. He paused. The second agent hasn't been located. The flat-voiced man from against the wall said nothing. He looked at the ceiling with the patience of someone who has already calculated his outcome and found it acceptable. She looked at Valles. Valles looked at her. There was a second missing agent, a network that had just demonstrated it could impersonate federal supervisors, and Marcus Webb was at Mercy Ridge right now, completing the end of his overnight shift, moving through the hallways of that hospital with his slow, unhurried ease, believing himself still invisible. Her secondary phone vibrated. She looked at it. The colonel. One line, Webb is moving. He's leaving the hospital early. We're losing him. She looked at Decker. I need a car. Donovan. Your people are managing the scene. Velez has the patience. You have 2 detainees and a missing agent and a supervisor impersonation to trace. She was already moving toward the back hallway. I'm the only person in this operation who can walk into that hospital and follow Webb without triggering his awareness. That's not ego. That's operational fact. I need a car. Decker was quiet for 2 seconds. She was already at the hallway. Blue Civic in the front lot, he said. Keys are above the visor. She went through the service door at a pace that was not quite running and got into the Denver Morning and found the blue Civic and drove. The colonel was on the secondary phone before she cleared the first intersection. Bert find out early told Quan the day shift charge nurse he had a family emergency. He's in his vehicle. We have eyes on him from the building camera. But we're going to lose him in 2 blocks. Which direction? West on Alameda. She was south of Mercy Ridge. West on Alameda put Webb moving away from the hospital, away from his home address in the federal file, toward the western edge of the city, where the commercial districts thinned out into light industrial and storage facilities, and the kind of buildings that didn't attract attention, the kind of buildings that were useful for ending things cleanly. She pushed the Civic through a yellow light and turned west. Colonel, the network can impersonate federal supervisors. They burned Decker's oversight team with a phone call. We know. We're working the origin. If they can do that, they know we're at Westlake. They know the external nodes are blown. Webb's not going to a secondary safe house. She accelerated through a gap in traffic. He's going to clean up. A pause. Claire, the second missing agent. Where was he assigned? The colonel didn't answer immediately. And the fact that he didn't answer immediately, the colonel, who always answered immediately because he had the answer ready before you finished, asking told her everything she needed to know. Where was the second agent assigned? She said again. He was the mobile tail on Webb, the colonel said. He picked him up at Mercy Ridge at 0400. She felt it settle through her, cold and clear. The second agent had been tailing Webb since 4A. Webb had signed out early at 6 a.m., and the second agent hadn't checked in since 5:40. Webb hadn't waited for last night to break open, to start moving. He'd been moving since 4A. M, and the agent who'd been following him, had disappeared, and Webb was now somewhere on Alameda, heading west at 6:22 in the morning, and Claire was 3 minutes behind him in a borrowed Civic, with no backup except Valles, who was 6 minutes away from Westlake in the wrong direction. She crossed a bridge over the Platte River. The sky above the water was wide and pale and empty. Her phone showed the colonel's line, still open. She could hear his breathing, which meant he was waiting for her to say something, which meant he was already at the edge of his operational authority, and she was about to step past hers. She turned west on Alameda. I have visual, she said, and it wasn't true yet, but it would be in 90 seconds. because she could see the light at the intersection 2 blocks ahead cycling through its sequence and through the Civic's windshield. At the far edge of her sightline, there was a black SUV that had just run the yellow on that light going too fast, slightly, for a man on his way to a family emergency. "Do not engage," the colonel said. The black SUV turned north into a lot that had no visible business signage, no parking structure, just a flat expanse of asphalt behind a chain-link fence, and a low building at the far end with its loading dock doors closed. She pulled past the lot entrance without turning in, parked on the street, looked in the rearview mirror at the black SUV sitting in the empty lot with its engine still running, and at the small figure of Marcus Webb getting out of the driver's side door, and at the second figure Simeon she hadn't seen before emerging from the building side entrance to meet him. "Colonel," she said, "I need you to listen to what I'm about to tell you. Claire Webb has a meeting, an in-person contact we haven't identified. This is not in any of your files. This person is new, and they are meeting Webb in an unsecured location with no federal presence within 6 minutes." She watched the 2 figures in the mirror. "If I wait, they're gone. If they're gone, the network seals itself and everything we've built in 6 weeks closes." The colonel's silence lasted 3 seconds. 4, 5. "You go in as a witness," he said. "Eyes only. You do not engage. You do not reveal your position. And the moment it becomes a threat-to-life situation." "I'll do what needs doing," she said. She got out of the Civic and moved toward the fence. The 2 figures in the lot were 40 meters at their backs to her, and the one she didn't met is away. Their basically didn't recognize was holding something at his side that caught the morning light in the flat, specific way that metal catches light when it isn't meant to be seen. The fence was chain link, 8 feet, with a 3-strand barbed wire cap that someone had installed seriously and maintained poorly. 2 of the 3 strands on the section nearest her were slack, the tension gone out of them over seasons of weather and neglect. She found the post with the loosest ground anchor, tested it with her foot, and went over in 12 seconds, which was slower than she'd have liked and faster than most people could manage. And she filed the 12 seconds away with the same mild irritation she'd filed the 50 seconds that's at the service door. She landed on the asphalt side and went immediately low, using the line of a parked flatbed trailer as cover. The 2 figures were still 40 meters away, which was now 38, because she'd moved and they hadn't. Their conversation had a physical shape to it, not relaxed, not confrontational, but the tight, abbreviated body language of 2 people who have agreed in advance on most things and are working through the remaining points quickly. Webb's back was still to her. The other man was partially visible around Webb's right shoulder mail, tall, wearing a dark jacket over a gray shirt, standing with his weight distributed the way people stand when they're not planning to move suddenly, but could. The object in his hand was more clearly metal now from this angle, a phone, not a weapon, which revised the immediate threat calculus but didn't resolve it, because the people who used phones to court things that needed coordinating were often more dangerous than the ones carrying obvious hardware. She moved along the trailer's length, slow, keeping below the trailer bed's line of sight. Her shoes on the asphalt were quiet. She'd trained herself out of heel striking in environments that required it so long ago that she no longer consciously managed it. The morning air was cold and still. No wind. Good for hearing, bad for cover. She stopped at the trailer's front end and listened. Webb's voice, carrying, can't hold the timeline. 2 of the nodes are in federal custody. The third, a pause. The third is manageable. The other voice deeper, older, the voice of someone who managed things from a distance and found the managing tedious. The timeline doesn't move. You knew the risk profile when you signed on. The risk profile didn't include a Webb stopped. There's a federal asset embedded in my department. Has been for weeks. I don't know her full clearance. I don't know her reporting chain. A pause from the other man. Her the nurse, Donovan. She's not what she filed as. Webb's voice had something in it now. Not fear, but the kind of friction that comes from reporting a variable you don't have a solution for. She managed the ER incident last night. The soldiers deferred to her. I've been running her file against every accessible database for 3 hours, and I'm hitting walls. I don't have clearance to see past. Then she's deep cover, which means she has a handler, which means the handler has a file. The other man's voice was doing a calculation out loud, and the calculation was not arriving at reassurance. The second transfer this morning, was that clean? It should have been. Westlake should have had 40 minutes of clear window before any federal response. Should have. The comms on the oversight team were disrupted. It bought time. I don't know how much. Claire held very still. Webb had known about the oversight team disruption, which meant he'd either arranged it himself or had been informed of it in real time, meaning the network had operational visibility on the federal team's movements that Decker had not accounted for, which circled back to the leak the flat-voiced man at Westlake had mentioned, which meant the information architecture of this operation had a hole she hadn't fully mapped yet. She pulled the secondary phone from her pocket. Typed to the colonel, Webb knows about me, has been running my file. 3 hours minimum started before he signed out. Also confirm, network had real-time visibility on Decker's oversight team. Leak is upstream of Decker. She pocketed the phone without waiting for a reply and stayed with the conversation. The tall man said, "Where are you going after this?" Clearing the secondary location. There are records that need to come out of the Mercy Ridge system before the federal access request lands. Patient routing data, referral logs. If they pull the full access history, how long to clear it? An hour, maybe 90 minutes. I still have system credentials. Use them today. Don't wait for the window to feel clean. There is no clean window anymore. Webb was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost the friction and returned to the slow, unhurried register she recognized from the IR, the voice of the man who had moved through Mercy Ridge for years, unrushed, trusted, unremarkable. And Donovan? The tall man's answer was short and flat. Handle it. She felt the words land in the cold air and stay there. Handle it was not an operational phrase, with a gentle interpretation. She'd heard it in 3 languages in circumstances where the handling had been confirmed afterward in ways that were not recoverable. It meant Webb had been given authorization from whoever the tall man represented to address her as a threat to the network. Not to report her, not to distance from her, to address her. She had approximately 90 minutes before Webb was back inside Mercy Ridge with active system credentials, actively destroying records, and an open authorization to handle the federal asset he'd identified as Claire Donovan. She needed him before he got there. She came around the end of the trailer. She didn't run. Running in an open space against 2 people with situational awareness was a tactical error. It announced your position. It closed distance faster than your own read of the environment. And it gave the other party time to react while you were still mid-approach. She walked fast and direct, and she'd covered 15 meters before Webb's peripheral vision caught movement, and he turned. His face went through 4 distinct expressions in approximately 1 second. She recognized all of them: recognition, confusion, recalculation, and the specific kind of fear that arrives when a variable you've been analyzing from a safe distance materializes in front of you without warning. "Dr. Webb," she said. She kept her hands visible, loose at her sides. "We need to talk." The tall man took a step to the left, the right from her perspective, the lateral movement of someone opening up their angle. She tracked it without looking directly at him. "I don't know who you are," he said, "but this is private property." "It is," she said, "and I've been on it for the last 4 minutes, so that conversation is already past." Webb said, with the voice of someone attempting to reconstruct his normal register and not quite getting there, "Claire, what are you doing here?" "I followed you from Mercy Ridge." She stopped 12 feet from him. Close enough for conversation, far enough that the tall man's lateral position didn't create a geometry she couldn't manage. I saw the early sign out. I wanted to talk about the 440A M transfer. This isn't the place for a... It's the place we have. She looked at him steadily. Mr. Holloway, she used the name she'd pulled from the secondary phone's response, which had arrived 11 seconds ago, from the Colonel, Tall Man ID, probable Neil Holloway, Regional Coordinator, Flag Network. Active federal warrant in process. I'd recommend staying where you are. Holloway went very still. The stillness had a specific quality. The stillness of someone running a new calculation about how much she knew and where that information had come from. You have 30 seconds, Holloway said, before this becomes something you don't want it to be. You've already authorized Webb to handle me, she said. That happened about 90 seconds ago. So the thing I don't want it to be is already what it is. She looked at Webb. I have the conversation recorded, Marcus. Webb's face did something difficult. Not guilty. He was past the register, where guilt was the relevant response. It was the face of a man watching an exit close. She didn't have the conversation recorded. She had the secondary phone, which had been in her pocket during the exchange, and the secondary phone's recording function required manual activation that she had not performed. But the claim cost her nothing, and it restructured the negotiation. Because Webb didn't know what she had, and Holloway didn't know how deep her operational access went, and uncertainty, properly deployed, was its own kind of leverage. Federal agents are at Westlake, she said. Your 2 external contacts are in custody. The patient you transferred at 0540 is safe. She paused. The second agent, the one your network redirected away from the building, has been located. He's fine. The last part was a guess, but it was an educated one, and the colonel hadn't contradicted it. The piece you're missing is that the man you had redirect him used a federal supervisor's identity to do it. That's a separate charge from everything else, and it's the kind of charge that prosecutors use to flip the person who made the call. Holloway said nothing, but his weight had shifted. The records you were going to clear from Mercy Ridge's system, she said to Webb. They've been mirrored. The access request went in at 0600. Your credentials will still work, but every entry you make from this point will be logged in a secondary system you can't reach. Webb said very quietly, that's not how Mercy Ridge's system. Not Mercy Ridge's system. A federal overlay. It went live last night after the ER incident. She watched him process it. You can go in and delete whatever you want. It won't matter. This was true. The colonel had confirmed the system overlay in his 4A. Call it had been part of the protocol once the operation moved from passive surveillance to active containment. Webb's credentials were now a liability for him, not an asset. Holloway made his decision. She saw it happen, the shift from assessment to action, the specific forward loading of weight that precedes movement. She was already adjusting her stance when he moved, and what he reached for was not the phone in his right hand, but something at the small of his back, under the jacket, and in the half second before he completed the reach, she closed the distance between them by 4 feet and redirected his drawing arm upward. Not a strike, a redirect, using the mechanics of his own motion against its completion, and the thing at his back came out wrong, at the wrong angle, pointing at the sky instead of at her. It was a compact semi-automatic. She had his wrist. She applied pressure to the specific point on the inside of the wrist that compromised grip without requiring significant force, and the gun hit the asphalt, and Holloway made a sound that was mostly surprise and partly pain. Webb ran. She let him go. That was the calculation she'd made in the 3 seconds before Holloway moved. If Holloway was the one with the weapon, Holloway was the immediate problem. And Webb running was manageable because Webb was a hospitalist with a system access code and a collapsing network, not a trained problem. She kept Holloway's wrist, walked him to the flatbed trailer's side panel, and pressed him against it with the economical firmness of someone who has done this many times and knows that elaborate holds are less reliable than simple, well-applied pressure. "Don't move," she said. He didn't move. He was breathing hard, not from exertion, from adrenaline, and he was staring at the side of the trailer with the expression of a man revising his operating assumptions. She keyed the secondary phone one-handed. "Colonel, Holloway is contained. Webb is on foot, heading east across the lot. I need the nearest unit. Valles is 3 minutes out. Denver PD has 2 cruisers on Alameda. I'm directing them to the lot now. Tell them to look for a heavyset man in a gray coat moving east toward the fence line. He is not armed as far as I can confirm. He will not fight. He'll comply." Received. A pause. Claire, the second agent. Webb's network didn't redirect him. He was pulled by his own supervisor for an unrelated matter. He's fine. He's been trying to reach Decker for an hour. She exhaled once, controlled, through her nose. So the flat-voiced man at Westlake made an assumption. An incorrect one. Webb's network didn't get to the agent. They just got lucky that the agent wasn't there. A beat. It made them think their reach was longer than it is. She held Holloway against the trailer and waited for the sirens. They came in under 4 minutes, which was the fastest Denver PD response she'd seen outside an active shooting call. 2 cruisers from Alameda, lights on, turning into the lot entrance with the particular urgency of units that have received a federal directive rather than a standard dispatch. They found Holloway against the trailer and Webb face down on the asphalt near the east fence, where he'd made it approximately 60 meters before his physical conditioning, the kind you don't maintain when you've spent 20 years as a hospital physician, had run out. The officers were professional. They cuffed both men, read the required language, separated them into different cruisers. One of the officers, a woman in her 30s, who had the tired face of someone, past the middle of a long shift, looked at Claire with the specific look that law enforcement reserves for civilians who have. Produced a situation they're being asked to clean up. "You the federal contact?" she said. "I work with the federal team, yes." Identification? Claire gave her the secondary credential, a laminated card with her photograph and a federal designation number that would verify through the JSOC liaison office, and Alfred Southop thought for approximately nothing about what she actually did. The officer looked at it, looked at Claire, looked at the 2 men in the cruisers. "There's a gun on the ground over by the trailer," Claire said. "That belongs to the man in the second cruiser. I'd recommend an evidence bag before anyone else handles it." The officer looked at the gun, looked back at Claire. "You disarmed him?" "Yes. By yourself." He wasn't expecting resistance. She kept her voice neutral. "The gun will have his prints and mine. Mine are on file with the Federal Liaison Office." The officer made a note. She didn't ask further questions about the disarming, which suggested she decided that the answer would only complicate her paperwork, which was the correct professional assessment. Valles arrived while the evidence bags were being deployed. She came across the lot with 2 of her soldiers and stopped in front of Claire with an expression that was not quite relief and not quite exasperation, but somewhere in the precise middle. "The colonel said eyes only," Valles said. "The colonel said eyes only until it became a threat-to-life situation." "And did it?" Claire looked at the cruiser where Holloway sat behind the rear window glass, his wrist wrapped in his own jacket, staring straight ahead. "He drew on me, so yes." Valles was quiet for a moment. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Okay." She turned to her soldiers, gave a quick series of hand signals, spread out, secure perimeter, wait for federal transport. They moved without discussion. Then she turned back to Claire. "The colonel wants you on a call at 0730. He said it's not operational. He said to tell you." She paused, checking something in her own memory, making sure she had the exact words. "He said to tell you, you were right about the timeline." Meaning the acceleration. Meaning Webb would have been inside Mercy Ridge, within the destroying records and the 48-hour window the colonel had offered her last night, would have become a closed door. She'd known that. She'd acted on it. The colonel was not a man who said you were right without purpose. He said it the way you mark a waypoint so that the map is accurate for next time. Tell him I'll be on the call, she said. The federal processing of Marcus Webb took 11 hours, which was 4 hours longer than standard, because of the layered nature of the charges, and because two separate federal agencies had jurisdictional interest in his case and needed to negotiate the order of operations before anyone could formally interview him. Claire knew this because the colonel briefed her at 7:30 from a conference room at the Denver field office, where she was present in person for the first time in the 6 weeks she'd been operating in the city. The field office was on the 14th floor of a building that looked like a commercial accounting firm, which was the point. The conference room had a window that looked north, and in the distance she could see the faint outline of the mountains, which were doing what Denver mountains always did in the morning, looking closer than they were, the atmosphere compressing distance into something deceptively intimate. She had slept for 40 minutes in a chair near the building's elevator bank while the processing was underway. It wasn't enough, and it was what was available. The colonel was on a screen at the head of the table. Not in Denver, never in Denver, always 3 time zones and 1 chain of command away. He looked the same as he always looked on screens, gray, precise, slightly overlit. Webb is cooperating, he said. Preliminary cooperation, provisionally. His attorney arrived at 9 and recommended he talk, which tells you something about the weight of what we have on him. What's he giving? This came from Decker, who was also present, his unremarkable face now holding the specific texture of a man who has had a difficult morning and is managing its professional implications. He'd been quiet since the field office briefing began, the posture of someone recalibrating rather than defending. The network architecture, names, locations, routing patterns. The patient pipeline ran through 6 hospitals in 3 states. Mercy Ridge was the anchor node. It had the most accessible federal designation data because of the patient population its ER serves. The colonel looked at Claire as he said the next part, and it was the look of someone delivering information he considers her entitled to hear before anyone else in the room does. Webb has been operating for 2 years. The initial contact was through Holloway, who ran the regional coordination. Above Holloway, there are 2 more levels we haven't mapped yet. Webb is talking because he believes cooperation gets him a ceiling on his exposure. Whether that's accurate is the prosecutor's determination. 2 years, Decker said. He said it, the way you say a number you'd hoped would be smaller. Confirmed transfers of 12 protected individuals across the 6 hospital nodes. Of those 12, 9 are currently accounted for. The other 3 are the active recovery priority. The colonel paused. The records that Webb intended to clear from Mercy Ridge's system this morning have been fully captured by the overlay. The routing logs go back to the beginning. Every transfer, every authorization signature, every referral. Decker said nothing. He was looking at the table. Agent Decker, the colonel said. The leak in your oversight team. Decker looked up. The call that redirected your agent away from Westlake this morning. We've traced the origin. It came from a phone registered to a paralegal at the federal prosecutor's office that handles cases from this field office. The paralegal's accounts have been frozen pending investigation. A pause. The paralegal has no known connection to the network at this time. The working theory is that her credentials were compromised, her phone spoofed without her knowledge. So the leak isn't inside my team, Decker said. Correct. Your team is clean. The colonel let that land. The network's technical capacity is more sophisticated than the field assessment indicated. They've been spoofing federal communications infrastructure for at least 4 months. Webb confirmed it. Decker exhaled. Not relief, something more complicated. The particular exhale of a person who has been carrying a weight they weren't sure was theirs to carry and has just been told they can set it down. But the setting down doesn't erase the fact of having carried it. Claire looked out the window at the mountains. She was tired. The 40-minute chair sleep had taken the edge off the operational alertness, which meant The tiredness underneath was now accessible, and it was the specific tiredness of someone who had been running a continuous performance for 6 weeks and had, in the last 6 hours, let the performance collapse. Not publicly, not in any way that anyone in this room would see. But internally in the private accounting, she kept of herself. The distance between what she presented and what she was had closed a little, and the closing was exhausting in its own way. In Stockbats, "What's my status at Mercy Ridge?" she asked. The colonel looked at her. "That's the question I wanted to address last. I'd like to hear it now." A short pause. "The cover is burned." "Not entirely. Hendricks and Caldwell have been briefed at a level that's technically compatible with your continued presence, and they've both signed the appropriate agreements." But the ER staff saw the military response. "Sonia at triage has already told everyone in the department who will listen, and the department is small enough that everyone has listened." He looked at her steadily. "Operational judgment is that your effectiveness as an embedded asset at Mercy Ridge is substantially reduced, meaning I'm being reassigned, meaning we're discussing it." She turned away from the window. "What does the discussion look like?" "There's a position in Portland. Embedded in a hospital system with a much quieter operational profile, early-stage surveillance. No active incident history. You'd be establishing a new cover from scratch." He paused. "Your sister lives in Portland." She looked at him for a moment without expression. The colonel had just told her that the people who built her operational files knew where her sister lived, which she had always known intellectually, and which landed differently in this conference room, at this hour, with 40 minutes of sleep. "When does the Portland decision need to be made?" she said. "End of the week." He let that sit. "There's also a non-operational option. We've discussed it before, and I've declined it before. Things change. They do." She looked back at the window. The mountains hadn't moved. They never moved. They just looked like they might sometimes in the early light. "I'll give you an answer by Friday." She drove back to Mercy Ridge at 11 in the morning. Not because she was scheduled. She was supposed to be on mandatory post-incident rest. The colonel had said it, Decker had said it, and even Vallis had raised an eyebrow when she'd asked for her car keys back. She drove back because there was a piece of the morning that wasn't finished, and she was someone who finished things. The ER was running its mid-morning rhythm quieter than overnight, but busy in the accumulated complaints way that late morning always was. The people who'd waited to see if the symptom would resolve on its own and had decided around 9 a.m. that it wouldn't. She parked in the visitor lot and went in through the main entrance rather than the staff entrance because she wasn't working, and she wanted to be clear about that. Sonia was at triage. She looked up when Claire came in, and her face did the thing it had been doing since 2:14 a.m. The recalibration, the revised hierarchy, the expression of someone who has updated their understanding of a person and hasn't yet found the right way to act on it. "You're not on shift," Sonia said. "I know. Is Caldwell in?" "He's in the break room." "Third cup of coffee." She paused. "He's been asking about you. What you were doing, whether you were okay." Claire nodded once. She walked back. Caldwell was alone in the break room. He was sitting at the table with a coffee mug and his phone and the look of a man who has had too much caffeine and too little sleep and too many questions for both to help with. He looked up when she came in, and something in his face settled, the way things settle when a worry you've been carrying resolves. "You're okay," he said. "I'm okay. I heard they made arrests. I don't know details. The federal people who came in wouldn't." He stopped. "I heard Webb was arrested. Marcus Webb. Is that?" "Yes." He sat with that. She watched him absorb it. 2 years of a colleague, rounds together, hand-off conversations, a man who'd moved through the department with his unhurried ease, and the absorption was visibly hard. Not because he'd liked Webb especially, but because the revision of a person you've worked beside is its own specific kind of disorientation. "How long were you?" He stopped, rephrased. "Were you here because of him?" "Partly." The situation was more complex than any one person. But you knew when you started, I had reason to look. She paused. I didn't know it was him until this morning. He turned the mug in his hands. It was a Mercy Ridge mug, the logo slightly faded from too many cycles through the break room dishwasher. I submitted the correction on your performance notes, he said. First thing I did when I came in today. Sandra told me. He stopped, started again. He was doing that thing where a person is trying to say something that their professional training hasn't given them language for, because the professional training was built for a different kind of conversation. I want you to know that what I said in this department about your competence. The things I said to Webb. He looked up. I knew you'd heard me that night in the hallway. I'd already figured that out, and I said it anyway. She waited. That was wrong. Not just professionally wrong. It was wrong. He held her gaze. You caught Rosaria Fuentes' NSTEMI. You secured that ER last night in a way that He stopped. I don't know what to do with the distance between how I treated you and what you actually are. I'm trying to figure that out. She considered him, not with softness exactly, but with the absence of the armor she'd been wearing since the first shift. You're a good doctor, she said. That's also true. He blinked. He hadn't expected that. You're difficult, and your assumptions run ahead of your evidence, and you use authority cutlery as a substitute for conversation. But when Rosaria went to the cath lab, you'd already read every note I'd written, and you added, 2 things I missed. She looked at him steadily. People are complicated. You're complicated. That's not an excuse. But it's also not the whole picture. He was quiet for a moment. Are you staying? At Mercy Ridge. She thought about the Portland conversation, about her sister's 2-day-old text message sitting in a powered-down phone in her glove compartment, about the mountains through the field office window, always closer than they were. I don't know yet, she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said in 6 weeks that wasn't operationally necessary. She left him with his coffee and walked back through the ER through the morning rhythm of it. The monitors, and the gurneys, and Sonia's triage voice, and the particular smell of antiseptic that she had, without meaning to, come to associate with something she would not have called comfort, but was adjacent to it. She pushed through the ambulance bay door and stood in the mid-morning outside, and pulled out her secondary phone and read the message that had come in while she'd been talking to Caldwell. It was from the colonel. 1 line, and it wasn't about Portland. Holloway is talking. He named the 2 levels above him. Claire, one of the names, is someone you know. She stood in the cold outside Mercy Ridge Medical Center and read the line twice. Then she typed back, who? The answer came in 8 seconds, and when she read it, she stood completely still for a moment. Not from shock, exactly. Because she'd trained the shock response out of herself so thoroughly that what she felt instead was the cold clarity of a picture that has just resolved from blur into focus. The name on her screen was not a network coordinator. It was not a regional contact or an external node or a hospitalist with a redirection scheme. It was the name of a person who had shaped the operational parameters of her current assignment. A person who had access to her covered documentation, her reporting chain, her personal phone number. A person inside the structure she reported to. The name on the screen was Deputy Director Carl Ostrander. She read it twice, not because she hadn't understood it the first time, but because the brain does a thing when it encounters information that rewrites a significant portion of its operating picture it runs the data through again, checking for the error that would make it less true. There was no error. The name was there, 8 characters, and behind those 8 characters was a man she had briefed 3 times in the past year, a man who had signed off on her Mercy Ridge assignment, a man who had known her personal phone number because he'd called it himself in February to tell her the operation timeline was moving forward. She stood outside the ambulance bay and did not move for 11 seconds. Then she typed to the colonel, "How solid is the identification?" The response came fast, which meant he'd been waiting for her to ask. Holloway gave us 3 corroborating data points before his attorney shut it down. Financial transfer records, a communication log, and a meeting location that matches Ostrander's travel record for October. We're treating it as credible pending full verification. She typed, "Does Ostrander know Holloway is talking?" A pause, longer than the Colonel's previous pauses. Unknown. We moved fast. But he has access to the same intake system the field office uses. If he's monitoring, she didn't wait for the rest of the sentence. She turned around and went back inside. The thing about a compromised chain of command was that it didn't announce itself. It didn't come with a warning label or a moment of obvious rupture. It arrived as a slow retroactive contamination. You looked back at decisions that had seemed reasonable and found new shapes in them, the shapes of a person who had been protecting something other than the operation. Ostrander had approved her Mercy Ridge assignment. He'd also approved the 48-hour surveillance window that had very nearly given Webb enough time to destroy his records and vanish. He'd approved Decker's oversight team for Westlake, a team whose location had been burned, whose agent had been redirected, whose communication window had failed at exactly the wrong moment. None of those decisions had looked like sabotage when they were made. That was the craft of it. You didn't blow an operation by making obviously bad calls. You made slightly suboptimal ones that were defensible in a review, ones that created just enough friction to give the network time to move. She found Velez in the parking lot, still coordinating the transfer of Holloway and Webb's evidence to the federal transport vehicle. She pulled her aside 2 steps away from the nearest soldier. "I need you to do something for me," Claire said. "Outside your standard reporting chain." Velez looked at her. "How far outside?" "All the way outside. Direct to JSOC command, bypassing the field office and bypassing the liaison office." A pause. Velez was not a person who paused often. "You're telling me the liaison office is compromised?" "I'm telling you there's a name I can't share with you yet that is credibly linked to the network at a senior level. Until that name is confirmed and contained, I need information moving through a channel that person can't monitor." She held Velez's gaze. "Can you do that?" "I can do that." No hesitation after the pause. The pause had been the full consideration, and the decision that followed it was complete. "What do you need moved?" "Tell JSOC Command that the Mercy Ridge operation has identified a potential internal compromise at the deputy director level. Tell them the colonel has the specifics and is moving to verify. Tell them to initiate a communications blackout on Ostrander's access to active operation files, effective immediately, pending review." She paused. Use those words exactly. Pending review. Not suspected or alleged. Pending review. The distinction mattered. Suspected triggered a different protocol one that required field office notification, which would route through the same compromised channel. Pending review was administrative language, the kind that moved quietly through bureaucratic systems without activating the alarm structures. "Done," Velez said. She already had her secondary phone out. Claire left her to it and went back inside to find a quiet corner and call the colonel directly. He answered before the first ring completed, which meant he'd been holding his phone. "Ostrander has access to the field office intake system," she said without preamble. "How long before his access is logged when he checks Holloway's processing status?" "It's already logged. He pulled the intake file at 10:47 this morning." She checked the time. It was 11:23. He knows Holloway is talking. We have to assume yes. Then we have a window that's closing. If Ostrander moves to protect himself, destroys records, exits a communication channel, contacts anyone else in the network, we lose the 2 levels above Holloway that Webb hasn't identified yet. She kept her voice flat and even, "What's his schedule today?" "He's in a budget review meeting until 1 p.m. at the main office. After that, the calendar is clear." Budget review meetings were the operational cover of choice for people who needed to appear present and accountable while managing a crisis elsewhere. She knew that, because she'd used them herself. "He'll move after the meeting," she said. "He'll have a story ready, a personal emergency, a field consultation, something that pulls him out of the building without triggering the automatic flag on an unscheduled departure. He's going to have 2 hours of clean time this afternoon before anyone notices he's gone, and he's going to use them." "What do you want to do?" She almost laughed. Not from amusement, from the specific recognition that the colonel, who had 30 years in a room full of analysts, was asking her. Because she was the one who had been inside this operation for 6 weeks, and she was the one standing outside a Denver ER with mud from an industrial lot on her shoes and 40 minutes of sleep in her body. And she was the one who understood the shape of what they were dealing with. We were dealing with at the granular level that intelligence products didn't capture. "I want him to come to me," she said. The mechanics of it took 2 hours and required 3 things: the colonel's authorization, Valaise's coordination, and the particular bureaucratic instrument that Claire had been hoping she would never need to use, which was a provision in her operational charter that allowed her to request a face-to-face debrief with her supervising deputy director when she assessed her cover integrity as critically compromised. The request went through official channels, the compromised ones, intentionally. She wrote it in the careful language of someone. He wrote it in the careful language of someone who had been through a significant incident and needed guidance from her chain of command. She used phrases like operational clarity and asset reassessment and request for direct supervisory consultation. She made it sound like a rattled operative who needed her hand held. Ostrander agreed to the meeting in 40 minutes. She'd expected him to take longer, to weigh whether the meeting was a trap against whether declining would look suspicious, but he came back fast, which told her one of 2 things. Either he'd already decided she was an asset he could manage rather than a threat he needed to avoid, or he was moving faster than she'd estimated and wanted to know exactly what she knew before he disappeared. Either way, he was coming to Denver. The meeting was set for the field office, which was where he expected it. She changed the location at 90 minutes, out of practical reason, easily defensible. She cited an active evidence review at the field office that would compromise the confidentiality of the debrief. She proposed a neutral location, a federal use conference space in a building 3 blocks from the field office that was, as of 11 that morning, equipped with recording equipment and 2 JSOC observers behind a one-way panel. Ostrander accepted the change without comment. She ate a sandwich from the hospital cafeteria she didn't care, that she didn't taste and didn't care about, changed out of the clothes she'd been wearing for the past 9 hours into the spare outfit she kept in her car for operational contingencies, and drove to the conference space. Carl Ostrander was 54 years old, silver-haired, and had the particular physical bearing of a man who had been athletic in his 40s and had allowed himself to stop without fully acknowledging it. He arrived 6 minutes early, which was a control mechanism. Arriving early to a meeting you're uncertain about gave you time to read the room before the other person arrived. Except Claire had been in the room for 20 minutes, sitting at the far end of the conference table with a coffee she'd barely touched, and when he came through the door and found her already there, something crossed his face very quickly. She'd seen the same expression on Holloway, on Webb, on the flat-voiced man at Westlake. The specific recalculation of a person who realizes the geometry of the situation is not what they assumed. Claire. He set his bag down. Professional, warm, the practiced warmth of someone who had spent a career managing people below him and had gotten good at making the management feel like relationship. "I'm glad you reached out. Last night sounded significant." "It was," she said. "Sit down, please." He sat. He put his hands flat on the table, an openness gesture, deliberate, and looked at her with the expression of a concerned superior. "Talk me through it." "I will," she said. "But first I want to tell you what I know." A fractional pause. "Of course. Neil Holloway is in federal custody. He's been cooperating since approximately 9 this morning. As of the last briefing I received, he's provided 3 corroborating data points linking a senior official to the network's coordination structure. She watched his face. I also know that you pulled Holloway's intake file at 10:47 this morning. The warmth didn't leave his face immediately. That was the professional training. The warmth was load-bearing, and pulling it too fast was its own tell. But she could see it working, the effort of maintaining it against the information she'd just dropped. That's routine, he said. I pull intake files on active operations. It's part of my oversight. You pulled it 40 minutes after Holloway began cooperating, before the colonel had filed his preliminary report, before the field office had been formally briefed. She kept her voice even. The only way you knew Holloway was in intake at that specific time was if you were monitoring the system for his name. The warmth finished leaving his face. What replaced it was not hostility. It was the flat, professional surface of a man who has decided that the performance is no longer worth the cost and is assessing his remaining options. You're making a significant accusation, he said. I'm describing a sequence of documented events. She leaned forward slightly. Carl, I've been running this cover for 6 weeks. I know what careful looks like. I've been doing it long enough. What you built with Holloway and Webb and the patient pipeline was careful. It was slow, it was defensible at each step, and it worked for 2 years. She paused. But careful has a ceiling. When the structure below you starts talking, careful stops being enough. He said nothing. Webb gave us the patient routing architecture. Holloway gave us the financial transfers and the communication log. The 2 levels above Holloway, the ones Webb doesn't know, those come from the records we pulled from the federal systems before your access was restricted this morning. She watched that land. The access restriction had been Velez's work, moving through JSOC command, confirmed 40 minutes ago. You can't reach those records now, and you can't reach the people you'd normally contact to manage a situation like this. Because those communication channels have been flagged and are being monitored in real time. The room was very quiet. Outside, 3 blocks away, the normal sounds of a mid-morning city continued without reference to any of this. I want a lawyer, Ostrander said. There's one waiting outside. I had one brought in when I scheduled the meeting. She stood. There are 2 federal agents in the building who are going to come in now. Before they do, and this is not an offer, it's information the people above you in this network are not going to protect you. The structure you were part of protects its architecture, not its people. Holloway knows that. That's why he's talking. She walked to the door and opened it. The 2 agents came in, not Decker. She'd specified not Decker. She wanted people with no prior entanglement with this case, and she stepped aside to let them pass. Ostrander sat at the table with his hands still flat on its surface and looked at her with an expression she'd seen before and never liked seeing. The expression of a person at the precise moment they understand that the path they've been walking has ended, and the place it's ended is not where they intended to arrive. For what it's worth, she said, you were good at your job. The real part of it. Before. She didn't say it to be kind, she said it because it was true, and because the accounting she kept of herself required her to be accurate even when accuracy was uncomfortable. That part mattered to people. She left him with the agents and the lawyer, who was already coming through the outer door, and she walked down the hallway and out of the building into the November afternoon. And she stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the thin Denver sunlight and let the 6 weeks settle into something she could carry. The formal documentation of Ostrander's arrest and the network's full exposure took 3 weeks. Claire knew this because she was present for the first 2 of them in meetings, in depositions, in the careful bureaucratic process of building a legal case from the records and testimonies and financial trails that the operation had produced. She was present as a witness, as a source, and occasionally as the person who sat in a room with federal prosecutors and explained in clinical terms exactly what the patient pipeline had done to the 12 people it had processed. 9 of those 12 had been recovered and were safe. 2 had been relocated, their federal protection statuses rebuilt under new infrastructure, their lives disrupted in ways that would take years to normalize. The second patient transferred to Westlake on the morning. Everything broke open, had spent 4 days in a genuine medical facility, recovering from the effects of the sedation, and was home with his family by the end of the second week. The 3 patients whose whereabouts had initially been unknown were found within 10 days of Ostrander's arrest, as the network's architecture was unwound and its secondary locations identified. All 3 were alive. That was not a certainty anyone had been willing to make in the first 72 hours, and when the confirmation came through, Claire was in a conference room at the SOC-JSOC liaison office reading a deposition transcript, and she sat for a moment with that information and let it be what it was, not a victory. Because 3 people had been moved without their consent through a system that had treated them as variables rather than human beings, and no legal outcome erased that. But they were alive, and they were accounted for, and in the accounting that mattered most, that was the number that carried the most weight. Marcus Webb pleaded guilty in the 4th week. His attorney had negotiated a cooperation agreement that reduced his exposure on the more serious charges in exchange for a full accounting of every patient transfer he'd authorized, every referral he'd redirected, every authorization signature he'd applied to a document he knew was not what it claimed to be. He sat in a federal courtroom in downtown Denver and read from a prepared statement in the slow, unhurried voice she recognized from the ER, and the statement contained 43 names, patients, contacts, transfer destinations, and by the time he finished reading it, the unhurried voice had developed a tremor that hadn't been there at the beginning. She was not in the courtroom for the plea. She was in the Mercy Ridge break room, drinking coffee that was better than she remembered it being, reading the news feed on her phone. Holloway took longer. His attorney was better, and his cooperation was more conditional in the process of validating his information against the records and Ostrander's own cooperating testimony, which came in the end because the 2 levels above him had already been identified from the records, and the value of his silence, was mathematically 0 took until the end of the month. When the charges were filed publicly, the network's full scope became visible for the first time. 31 individuals across 7 states operating inside medical, legal, and government institutions, running a pipeline that had processed federal protection assets for the benefit of adversarial interests that the charging documents described in the language of national security, and that Claire understood from her operational experience in plainer terms. These were people who had sold vulnerable individuals to the people those individuals were hiding from. The public filing ran on the evening news for 2 days. By the 3rd day, it had been replaced by other things, because the news moved the way it always moved forward, always forward, with the attention of a person walking through a room and noticing what's there only until the next room appears. Claire's name did not appear in any public document. It would not appear. That was the nature of what she did and who she was, and she had made her peace with that arrangement a long time ago, in circumstances that had required her to make peace with it quickly, or not at all. The last conversation with Ethan Caldwell happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the arrests, on the afternoon, before she turned in her Mercy Ridge access badge. He found her in the supply room, the narrow one, at the back of the ER, with a sticky lock because she'd gone there to return the equipment she'd been issued, and had taken a few extra minutes in the quiet before she gave it up. He knocked on the open door, which was not a thing Ethan Caldwell had ever done in the 6 weeks she'd known him. "I heard you're leaving," he said. End of the week. He came in, which made the supply room officially too small for 2 people, and leaned against the shelving opposite her. He looked less overlit than he had in the first weeks, less performatively exhausted, or maybe she was reading him differently now that the performance between them had ended. Back to the classified thing? Different assignment. She set the last of the equipment in the return bin. Different city. Portland? She looked at him. "Sonia told me your sister is in Portland." Sonia tells everyone everything. A pause. Is that a good thing? Being near family? She considered the question, honestly, which took a second because honest consideration of things about her own life was a practice she'd let get rusty. I don't know yet. It might be complicated. Yeah. He was quiet for a moment. My brother and I don't talk. 3 years. I keep meaning to call, and then he stopped. Made a small, self-aware gesture with one hand. Anyway, call him, she said. He looked at her. Not because things will be easy. They probably won't be if it's been 3 years. But the version of the conversation where you don't call gets longer every year, and eventually it becomes the conversation you can't have anymore. She held his gaze. Call him. He was quiet for a moment. Is that advice or an order? It's an observation, she said, from someone who has spent a long time prioritizing operationals over everything else and has started to notice what that costs. He nodded slowly. It was not an enthusiastic nod. It was the nod of a person receiving something they know is true and aren't entirely ready to act on, but are filing accurately. That was enough. You couldn't do more than file it accurately and hope the right moment found it. He could. You're actually good at this, he said. Nursing. Not just the, he gestured vaguely, meaning the rest of it. The actual nursing. Rosaria Fuentes, the pediatric dosing catch, the GSW assessment on Terrence. Any trauma center would be lucky to have you. She pulled the last inventory tag from the return bin and signed the digital log. You were wrong about me for 6 weeks, she said. And then you were right about me in the 7th. That ratio is fixable. She looked at him. Work on the ratio. He laughed. It was brief and genuine and slightly startled, the laugh of someone who hadn't expected to laugh, which was the best kind. I will, he said. She handed him the return log to countersign because protocol was protocol regardless of everything else, and he signed it without being asked, which was progress. She called her sister from the parking lot. Not on the secondary phone, on her personal phone, which had been restored to service with a new number 3 days after the operation closed, because the personal life that went with it deserved a number that worked. Her sister's name was Mara, and she answered on the second ring with the voice of someone who has been waiting for a call, long enough that receiving it produces more relief than surprise. Claire. Hey. She sat in the driver's seat with the door open and the cold air coming in and the Mercy Ridge parking structure framing a square of November sky. I'm sorry I dropped off. Are you okay? Yes. I'm okay. A pause. Are you going to tell me what happened? Some of it. Later. She looked at the square of sky. The mountains were visible at its edge, doing their near-than-they-were thing. I'm thinking about coming to Portland. The sound her sister made was not a word. It was the sound of someone who has wanted something for long enough that its arrival removes language temporarily. I don't know what it looks like yet, Claire said. The work, or how long, or it's complicated. It's always complicated with you. I know. I don't care, Mara said. Come anyway. She sat in the car for another minute after she hung up, not thinking about the operation or the charges or Ostrander's arrest, or any of the formal things that were still unwinding in federal buildings across the city. She sat and let the parking lot be just a parking lot, and the sky be just the sky, and the cold air be just the cold air. She had spent 6 years in a version of herself that was load-bearing in every direction, carrying the cover, carrying the work, carrying the gap between what she was and what she presented, and carrying the accumulated weight of a system that had, it turned out, been partially rotted at its center and had needed someone inside it to refuse to let that rottenness win. She had refused. She had done it quietly and carefully and without anyone's recognition for most of it, and the refusal had cost her things she would account for over time, in private, at whatever pace turned out to be right. But 12 people were home. 3 people who hadn't been accounted for were accounted for. A network that had operated for 2 years inside the institutions, meant to protect people, had been pulled out by its roots and handed to prosecutors who would spend the next year building the case that would end it permanently. Webb would not practice medicine again. Holloway would not coordinate anything from outside a federal facility for a very long time. Ostrander, the man who had known her phone number and her assignment and her cover, and had used that knowledge in the service of something that betrayed every person whose safety had ever been in his hands, Ostrander was facing charges that carried the weight of what he'd actually done. None of that was tidy. None of it resolved into something clean and complete. The world didn't work that way, and she had stopped expecting it to in the year she'd spent learning what the world actually was. But the accounting was honest, and the outcome was real, and in the work she'd chosen, and the way she'd chosen to do it, real and honest, were the only currencies that held value. She started the car. The thing about being underestimated, the thing she would have said, if anyone had asked her, if anyone had known enough to ask, was that it was both a wound and a tool, and the trick was not to let it be only the wound. People who dismissed you gave you information about themselves. People who assumed you had nothing under the surface, because the surface didn't announce itself, were telling you exactly how they understood power as performance, as volume, as the willingness to take up space and make noise. And people who understood power that way were almost always wrong about where it actually lived. It lived in the quiet. It lived in the woman in the supply room who listened and said nothing. It lived in the nurse who caught the EKG at 3:30 in the morning and didn't ask for credit. It lived in the 6 weeks of small, careful, accurate work that had built the foundation for everything that followed. It had always lived there in the people who kept doing the work when no one was watching, who held the line, who stayed precise because anyone would see them hold it, but because the line needed to be held. She had known that for a long time. She had learned it in harder schools than this one. She pulled out of the Mercy Ridge parking lot for the last time and turned north toward the apartment, toward the box. She'd already half-packed. Toward the phone call she still had to make to the colonel about Portland and the new assignment, and at the terms she was prepared to accept, and the ones she was not. She had a list of the ones she was not, and it was longer than it had been a year ago, and she was not sorry about that. The mountains sat at the edge of the city in the late afternoon light, closer than they were, the way they always looked from here. She drove toward them anyway,